This is Ron Peters.
I'm John Nugent.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After Class. Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. It's a beautiful morning in Lansing, Michigan. The sun is shining. The birds are singing. The students are leaving, have left.
Yeah.
They have left, yeah. The students, I'm just looking out there and there are so few cars, so little activity. I don't know, it's a mixed bag. I miss them because, I enjoy the relationships. But at the same time, the peace and quiet is just really nice, I have to admit.
Yeah, we had a great graduation this past Saturday.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
My last daughter graduated. So
it was pretty cool watching you hand her diploma, give her a hug and all that.
yeah. And Sam had a similar experience.
Yep.
Not quite the finality. But
No. My son got his associates. He had planned on just getting his associates and leaving, and then he went through all the work to say that he had it, and then he's changed his mind and is staying. So he just went through with it. So gave him a little hug and gave him his diploma.
Yeah, but good for him.
He was not ready for that.
No, it
Caught
took
him by
him
surprise.
off. Yep. Off guard.
Was he embarrassed in front of his friends?
No. Yeah. Damn.
Why?
Exactly.
No, he's not.
What are you doing?
He's not like that. So yeah, it was great. The speaker was fantastic. Really challenged the students in the audience to, do some things, which I forget what they were, but
but they were challenging them.
Do the hard thing.
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ironically, we were just telling our daughter that we've been going through that lately with her. So she's in the throes of dance competition and AP tests and all this stuff, and she just wants to be done. Like, well, that's one option, but
That's one option. Yeah. Wes Beavis from Australia.
Yep. He had a lot of energy, for a
he
guy
sure
who's-
did.
Yeah, he was all over the stage and very, gestural and all of that. He's just really brought the energy to it. But he was fun to listen to. He was really fun to listen to. I like the way that he started with a story. He had that early on story about like going to the hospital and feeling like he had wasted his time. And after he finished that story, I'm like, he's going to tie this in somehow. Like he's going to circle back to that. And sure enough, he tied it in to where that story had a happy ending. And
I'm so glad he did, because after he told that story, I said, that's a terrible illustration of the point you're trying to make.
yeah.
Yep.
You gave a negative.
Yeah.
You didn't give a positive.
And it was like, get up and do the hard thing, but it won't matter because it.
Yeah, here's an opportunity that I did the hard thing and it didn't work out. So, hey, it doesn't always work out when you do the hard thing. Moving on to the next point.
Yeah.
Just like, which was great because he left you criticizing him internally, and then later on he works it back in
Yep.
so perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. It was one of the best graduation, and it's online, right? I mean, we record
I
these
assume
things.
it was
so,
streamed on our Facebook page.
yeah, if you want to see Wes Beavis' excellent address, well, go on there and find it.
Make
Yeah.
sure it's on the right Facebook page. There's a competing. Well, our whole Facebook page got hacked and taken
hijacked
from us, and not.
Last year.
Yeah, and so there's another one now that you've changed the names and things, but they still have all our stuff on it. But if it clearly doesn't say Great Lakes Christian College, it's not us, and there's nothing new about Great Lakes since the last year and a half. Yeah,
Right.
So I guess that's enough news.
that's plenty.
Yeah.
We are starting the new series.
Praise the Lord.
We put out some feelers a while back about the possibility of doing a series on intertestamental literature, and some of you were like, yes, that'd be great. I've been dying to learn more about those books, and others were like, really, do you have to? I'm not all that
Right.
interested. So we kind of are doing a compromise. We're not going to do a whole series on intertestamental literature, but we did think it would be good to do a series on the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
And it'll be shorter. And then maybe later we'll come back to maybe some of the pseudepigrapha works, or maybe we'll do a little mini series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we're not going to hit you with the whole collection all at once. Just go through the books that are in what most of you would know as the Catholic Bibles. They have more books.
Yes, they do.
And those books are in there for a reason. It wasn't a papal conspiracy. So we want to go through some of these. One of you want to just say something about, what the Apocrypha is all about, where it comes from?
We're
What
both
it
looking at
is.
each other
Sure,
like,
we can both say things. They're written between the testaments. That's why it's called intertestamental. Most of them we don't know who wrote them. I don't think we know anyone who wrote them. Sometimes they're in the voice of another person that we know, sometimes not, and they're all just intended to kind of like expand on stories that we know and things that we know. Some of them, others are more historically based. I can talk.
yeah.
And giving some history type things.
Yeah.
And so it's really an interesting compilation of different types of literature.
Yeah.
And all intended to encourage Jews in some way. That would be a quick take from me.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of people talk about the 400 years of silence,
Yeah.
From the Old Testament to the New Testament. And many people just don't realize that there is a plethora of Jewish writings from that time period that were never, for the most part, were really never recognized as having the same authority, where there were some debates about it. But nevertheless, they had a tremendous impact on Jewish thinking. And, we're going to be looking at these Deuterocanonical books. But even beyond that, when you get into the pseudepigrapha, as you begin to study it, many things that you see in the New Testament begin to make more sense. It's like, oh my gosh, this didn't just appear out of nowhere, but rather this was the conversation that people were having even hundreds of years before Jesus came. And so, as Sam said, you've got a lot of different genres. You've got wisdom, you've got history, you've got poetry. But I think what they do is they really round out our knowledge. For me, the New Testament gained a lot more meaning to me as I began studying the Deuterocanonical and pseudepigraphal books.
Yeah.
And so I think that for our listeners who really care about understanding ancient Judaism, understanding the New Testament, that this is an opportunity to introduce you to material that I think is going to help you understand things in a much better way. And I look forward to hearing feedback from people, even the ones who are like, I don't know if I want to listen to this miniseries. I'd encourage you to listen anyway, because you might find that you're going to get a lot more out of it than you thought.
Should we make the disclaimer that we're not pushing for inclusion in the canon?
Correct.
We're saying they're great books that are helpful to round out our knowledge. And we're not saying they're from, inspired by God in that way. It's just, that's what they are.
Even if you're skeptical of them,
Yeah.
at least learn what it is you're skeptical of.
Mhm.
Right. And so some people have unnecessary fears about the Apocrypha or the Catholic Bible or the Catholics because they have extra books in their Bible. And,
Right, yeah.
and some of those fears are grounded on ignorance of the kind of material that's in here.
Yeah.
And you're going to see today, we're going to go through, in addition to the book of Daniel called Susanna, which is just an amazing story.
Yeah, I love this.
It's a fun story.
There's stuff in here that is really excellent.
Mhm.
Good writing, good moral values that are communicated. So, and just, those of you who are wondering about, canon and how it got in there, or how it didn't get in there, and, why it's in some and not others. The translation of the Hebrew Bible, which began around 250. That's kind of a symbolic date. At least the Torah was completed by then, right? And then continued on into the centuries leading up to Jesus. As it was translated into Greek, these collections of writings, of Greek writings that were translations of the Old Testament, included additional books that were, some of them that were written directly in Greek, like the first time, some of which were also translated from a Hebrew or Aramaic original into Greek. And these extra books, some of them are extra books, like the Book of Tobit, and some of them are additions to pre-existing Old Testament books. Like we have additions to Daniel, which we're going to talk about today. We have additions to Esther.
Yep.
And, for the early Christians who had this version of the Bible, like, in Palestine, a lot of them could read Hebrew, so that worked out. But like as missionaries went into the Western world, that was a Greek-speaking world.
Yeah.
And their Bible would have been Greek Bibles. They would be working with these Greek translations that began with the Septuagint and continued on into the time of Jesus. Like that would have been the only version of the scriptures that they would have been able to read, would have included some of these books.
Yep.
And so, I think the argument from the Catholic Church is, this is the version that would have most been used by the early church, and therefore it's the church's Bible. And when Jerome, around 382, translated the Bible into Latin for the Roman Church, he had to make a choice about these additional books, right? And he noted that, these books were not in the Hebrew Bible. Like the Jewish canon didn't include what we call the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
Yet Christians were using these Greek Bibles that did include the books, and so he had to make a choice. What is he? And so he was translating for the for the church.
Yep.
And he had this logistical problem. The Jews stopped here, but some Christians kept going. So he made a choice to consider the books of the Old Testament as canon, but he also translated the additional Greek books from the intertestamental period that are found in this collection, and just called them Deuterocanonical or secondary canon.
The second canon, yep.
So that's kind of some of the backstory behind it. And so we just want to expose you to it because, it's enjoyable.
It is, I agree.
And it's genuinely intellectually stimulating to learn about what's going on in these Jewish communities. And it kind of gives you insights into what were the Jews doing before the time of Jesus?
Right, yeah.
And how did they live their life in exile? What institutions were emerging among them that are normal by the time of Jesus that he might be interacting with them?
Yeah.
So today we're going to start with the additions to Daniel.
You're so good.
Yeah. And so, for the early church which would have had the Greek version of Daniel, there wouldn't be a section called the additions to Daniel.
It'd be Daniel.
It would be their version of Daniel would have had this additional material as part of it.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be like a little disclaimer around it saying, hey, these were additions. It's just the only Daniel they knew.
Yeah.
Right.
So their book of Daniel included a story called Susanna.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a great story.
It's of all the Deuterocanonical stories, this is right at the top for me. I love sharing it. At church, I've told the story a couple times as I'm preaching, and I just think it's such a great story that I get excited talking about it. I'm happy to share it with our audience.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff in the Deuterocanonical stuff that I like, but man, this is like right at the top.
And so in some Greek versions of the book of Daniel, this story was actually at the beginning of the book. Like, it's how the book started. And in other manuscripts that we have access to, it's at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of the evidence of these editions is kind of they appear in different places in different versions. But you'll see why this would be a good one to have at the beginning, because it kind of introduces our hero Daniel for the first time. It's like this is like Daniel's great unveiling of this great wise Jew in the midst of the exilic community.
Right.
This is the story that kind of puts him on the map, so to speak. So we'll break the story into a few chunks, and we'll kind of read verses 1 through 14, and then talk about it a little bit, and then go on through it. It's really only one pretty long chapter.
Yeah.
But we'll break it up, talk about it, and
It's a very short story.
yeah, short
Generally
story.
speaking. All right, Susanna, verse 1. There was a man living in Babylon whose name was Joachim. He married the daughter of Hilkiah named Susanna, a very beautiful woman who feared the Lord. Her parents were righteous, and he had trained their daughter according to the law of Moses. Joachim was very rich. He had a fine garden adjoining his house. The Jews used to come to him because he was the most honored of them all. That year, 2 elders from the peoples were appointed as judges. Concerning them, the Lord had said, "Wickedness came forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges, who were supposed to govern the people." These men were frequently at Joachim's house, and all who had a case to be tried came to them there. When the people left at noon, Susanna would go into her husband's garden to walk. Every day the 2 elders used to see her going in and walking about, and they began to lust for her. They suppressed their consciences and turned away their eyes from looking to heaven or remembering their duty to administer justice. Both were overwhelmed with passion for her, but they did not tell each other of their distress, for they were ashamed to disclose their lustful desire to seduce her. Day after day they watched eagerly to see her. One day they said to each other, "Let's go home, for it's time for lunch." So they both left and parted from each other. But turning back, they met again, and then when they pressed each other for the reason, they confessed their lust. Then together they arranged for a time when they could find her alone.
What I like about the way the story begins is we see that it is good storytelling because, it sets the scene. These are people living in exile. And so we're introduced to the woman who the story is named after, Susanna, who is a beautiful, God-fearing woman. And so she's like set up in these just exalted terms. Not only is she beautiful in her physical appearance, but she's beautiful in her attitude towards the Lord. But then you're introduced to the bad guys, the
Yes.
antagonists of the story.
The wicked elders.
Yeah. And what's interesting about them is the way that they're built up. It's not just like there's these two guys who are lusting after her, but we get a little bit of a narrative of how separately they were lusting after her and how they regretted it, but they didn't regret it. And it takes a series of events for them to realize that they're both experiencing that same sort of lust. And so the way the story kind of builds those two characters in, I think, is really interesting. And it just shows the kind of literary skill, whoever's responsible for the story, the skill that person had.
Yeah, interesting side note for those who care. Shoshana in Hebrew can mean lily or rose, so it's just a beautiful name if you want.
Oh, okay.
People name their kids that these days, so that's an aside.
Well, but I mean that also just once again speaks to her. She is physically beautiful, but she's beautiful in the way she loves the Lord, and her name is a reflection of that.
Yeah, and it could be, symbolic names are given for the story. Like she was given a name that fits her role in it, which might testify that this may not be a historical account. Right? It's a story that was told, and characters were named after their role in the story. And so,
well, and it's interesting too that the elders have no names. We're given the name of Susanna, but these two wicked guys, we don't even name them. It's like their names have been stricken from the record. We'll reference their events, but we won't even speak their names.
Well, as I say, that's interesting. There's an illusion that it could be there are two prophets. Two elders in Jeremiah chapter 29 that are these wicked guys, and they're not, and they're often associated with those people. So this talking about the whole wickedness coming from Babylon, like, oh, Jeremiah has already talked about them.
Yeah.
There's some like it could be drawing upon that sort of understanding or history from before.
Oh, good observation.
Let me see what we can.
Yeah, it gives us some, and we're going to see more insight into just the nature of the post-exile community. They didn't have the temple. They didn't have, those structures. They didn't have the governors of Israel. They were in exile, and still the Jews appointed elders each year to kind of carry out some functions on behalf of the Jewish community. So even though they were living in Babylon, there were Babylonian rulers, Babylonian governors. The Jews there wanted their own leaders.
Yeah.
And they saw themselves as accountable to their own appointed leaders, not necessarily to the governing authorities. And we'll see that in the kind of the court that they convene later on. It's like, well, where are the Babylonian appointed court officials? Well, they're not even in the story.
Right.
Because the Jews have their own appointed officials who govern Jewish affairs.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating look at exilic living, because even though they're living under the power of Babylon at this point, we don't like Babylon. We're not here by choice. Really, we recognize our own laws and our own leaders. And so we're forced to live under Babylonian rule, but the only rule we really care about is ourselves. And when people violate our rules, we take care of business in-house. And I think that that's kind of interesting as a way of thinking about our own exilic living as Christians. The Bible talks about us as exiles. That's how we are to live. It's drawing upon the imagery that Israel's been living with for centuries and saying, nothing's really changed. We Gentiles have joined the community, but we're still exiles. And so we can learn a little bit about the way we go about our own business from a story like this.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll definitely come back to this at the end and how it might help us read a book like 1 Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll continue the story. So the stage is set. There's a beautiful woman.
Two guys lust after her.
Two guys left after her. And it is funny. They kind of they hold back, like they want to be peeping Toms, but they're like, the one is a peeping Tom and the other's a peeping Tom. And they bump into each other. Like, what are you doing here?
I thought you were going home. I thought
Not
you were
thing. What are you doing here?
Yeah.
Nothing.
And can't you just see this? Like, if somebody made this into like a movie, you can just see these two guys run into it. It's like, I thought you. It's funny because I almost see the scene it's like, well, I'm going home. Yeah, me too. And they stand there for a minute because each one's waiting for the other guy to turn away, and finally they both have to all right, I guess I'll just go home.
Yeah, and it shows you, I think, the fact that these are men of power, and then they talk to each other, and it's like, what are we doing? Why are we sneaking around? We're elders here.
Yeah,
we should be able to get what we want, and then they devise a plan to get what they want.
Picking up Susanna, verse 15. Once, while they were watching for an opportune day, she went in as before with only 2 maids and wished to bathe in the garden, for it was a hot day. No one was there except the 2 elders who had hidden themselves and were watching her. She said to her maids, "Bring me some olive oil and ointments and shut the garden doors so that I can bathe." They did as she told them. They shut the doors of the garden and went out by the side doors to bring what they had been commanded. They did not see the elders because they were hiding. When the maids had gone out, the 2 elders got up and ran to her. They said, "Look, the garden doors are shut, and no one can see us. We are burning with desire for you. So give your consent and lie with us. If you refuse, we will testify against you that a young man was with you, and this is why you sent your maids away." Susanna groaned and said, "I am completely trapped. For if I do this, it will mean death for me. If I do not, I cannot escape your hands. I choose not to do it. I will fall into your hands rather than sin in the sight of the Lord." Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice, and the 2 elders shouted against her. And one of them ran and opened the garden doors. When the people in the house heard the shouting in the garden, they rushed in at the side door to see what had happened to her. And when the elders told their story, the servants felt very much ashamed, for nothing like this had ever been said about Susanna. So this is like the middle part of the story, like the 3-act story. You get the setup at the beginning. Act 2 is always the dark part. Like in any 3-act story, the darkest part of it is Act 2. And this is like the darkest part when the accusations are brought against Susanna.
Yeah. And that's going to continue in the next reading, like Act 2. We're not done with Act 2.
Right.
It gets darker.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah, a couple things I would bring out is so she's left with this terrible decision, right? It's either I let them have me, or I say no, and then they're going to accuse me anyway, and I'm going to be in trouble. And I love that part where it says, "Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice, and the 2 elders shouted against her." And if I may go back to the Old Testament, it reminds me of Deuteronomy 22:23. It says, "If there's a young woman, a virgin already engaged to be married, and a man meets her in the town and lies with her, you shall bring both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death, the young woman because she did not cry for help in the town, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife." And just reminding me of that when she cried out, she's like, "No, if nothing else, no one can accuse me of not yelling." And like fulfilling Deuteronomy 22. And that's part of, I think, what's for me, that's what I thought of when I read that, okay, she's crying out, yes, for help on some level, but also it's all kind of revolving around like purity, and, for her, it's about keeping Torah. It's kind of in the background of it. And so that's what I thought of when I read that part.
Yeah. It's interesting, like right as soon as she's done, like right on the heels, they start yelling.
Right.
Because it's just like, oh, shoot, she got the jump on us.
Yeah.
Like, really, they should have been yelling first.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah.
And the fact that, so like right on the heels, they're yelling as if, so maybe people just heard commotion, but it's the elders that were the voice that came into clarity with them. And so, they recognize she's doing what she should do, and they're really trying to drown out her voice.
I think one of the things that stands out to me, it's more implicit than explicit, because it's not said explicitly. But when she cries out, she knows she's probably not going to be believed. And I agree with you, Sam. I think that she's remembering Torah. I think there's a part of her that recognizes that there's one person who knows this story that nobody else even thinks about, and that's God. And I think she's like, I can do what I have to save my life. I can sin to save my life, but God will know what I have done. And I will maintain my covenant loyalty to God by refusing to sin. And it's better to die and go into the afterlife than to save my life through sin. And it makes me think about what Jesus says, like in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't do your acts of righteousness before men, but only do them where God can see them. And I think for her, the one person she knows is still watching is God. And so she is completely in his hands.
Yeah. All right. Ready to continue the story?
Let's do it.
Sure. It reminds me, one quick more thing.
Sure.
It reminds me of Joseph and Potiphar's wife a little bit.
Yeah.
Roles reversed. And he said, Joseph said, when talking about this, refusing, he says, "Look with me here. My master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put me over everything he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And it reminds me of what she said when she said, "I choose not to do it. I will fall in your hands rather than sin in the sight of the Lord." Yeah. And so they're both upholding this chasteness.
Right.
Chastity? Chastiseness.
Justification.
Yep. Amen.
Yeah, and it shows, in both cases, the abuse of power.
Yeah.
People
Right,
who
yeah.
feel like they have more power over other people will try to take advantage of them in very overt sexual ways. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the story of our society, right? And people with power. So, continuing in verse 28, the next day, when the people gathered at the house of her husband Joachim, the two elders came, full of their wicked plot to have Susanna put to death. In the presence of the people, they said, "Send for Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, the wife of Joachim." So they sent for her, and she came with her parents, her children, and all her relatives. Now Susanna was a woman of great refinement and beautiful in appearance. As she was veiled, the scoundrels ordered her to be unveiled, so that they might feast their eyes on her beauty. Those who were with her and all who saw her were weeping. Then the two elders stood up before the people and laid their hands on her head. Through her tears she looked up toward heaven, for her heart trusted in the Lord. The elders said, "While we were walking in the garden alone, this woman came in with two maids, shut the garden doors, and dismissed the maids. Then a young man who was hiding there came to her and was intimate with her. We were in a corner of the garden, and when we saw this wickedness, we ran to them. Although we saw him have intercourse with her, we could not hold the man because he was stronger than we, and he opened the doors and got away. We did, however, seize this woman and asked who the young man was, but she would not tell us. These things we testify." Because they were elders of the people and judges, the assembly believed them and condemned her to death.
Well, talk about an abuse of power. Because, I mean, that line right there at the end, people believe them because they were elders. These guys are trustworthy members of our community. And so that is one of the really striking things there right at the end. Because they were elders, people believe them. Man, if anybody is listening who's in a leadership position, be careful of how you use that position of leadership. People might be trusting you. And if you abuse that leadership, I don't want to be in your place. I don't want to be nearby when the lightning strikes.
It's a bit of an issue where they're both the witnesses and the judges. It's not a
Yeah.
good situation,
Yeah,
right? There's
good
a
point.
conflict of interest, one might say.
Yeah.
And yes, there's an assembly that I think sort of reaches a conclusion, but it's not great when you have the people in charge also saying what happened without any other testimony.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're saying, Ron, how be careful, you who are in positions of leadership. I mean, you can abuse power and get away with it, so that will be a temptation.
Yeah.
Right, but also I would say be careful, congregations.
For real.
If someone brings an accusation before a leader, it may be that they're guilty.
Yeah.
You don't give a blank check to leaders because they're leaders.
Right.
But at the same time, you take seriously the need for witnesses. And this is the very thing that the New Testament, like pastoral epistles, are getting into, about witnesses and leaders and charges. And, there should be negative consequences for, like, bringing up bogus charges against your leaders. Because there are some people who want to be leaders, and they try to take down the leaders with false charges, right?
Yep.
So you got to protect those kinds of leaders, right, who are doing the right thing, and people who want their power are trying to besmirch their character. And at the same time, you have wickedness among the leaders, and it'll be hard for you to believe accusations against them because you can't imagine them doing something like this.
Yeah.
And so there have been women who have been abused by leaders in the church, and those leaders have been protected.
Yep.
Because it's just assumed, no, that could never happen.
Yeah.
And so this is a story. It's an ancient Jewish story that sheds, light on a very contemporary problem in the church today.
Well, what you're describing, it makes me think of a Christian non-canonical book. It was kind of canonical for a while, First Clement, which is a letter written probably around the same time, roughly, as like Revelation or the writings of John. And in that letter, one of the things that the author is dealing with is divisions in the church at Corinth. Surprise, surprise, Corinth is having divisions. But in this case, some younger men are bringing charges against elders. And it's a similar situation that you're describing there, John. And Clement and his fellow elders in Rome are trying to bring wisdom and guidance to the church there at Corinth. And so the early church did run into situations where young people brought malicious charges against elders, and the church had to deal with it. And so, yeah, it's stuff that happened in Jewish communities, it's stuff that happened in Christian communities.
Yeah, and for me, it gets to what's behind a story. Why are they writing it? It's not just a fun story about Susanna. That's not the point. There's something else going on, and so you wonder because you look at the prophets, you see them lambasting leaders regularly for not doing their jobs, whether they're priest or prophet, and so the same sort of thing. Like, is this still going on centuries later when this is being written? And possibly because there's a high call to leadership. There's also high temptation once you get there. It also reminds me of Naboth's vineyard and setting up people against him to testify against him so that King Ahab could get his vineyard. Like, just the idea of false testimony. That's why there's a commandment against it. They're all over the place trying to avoid abuse of power and even in laws, and yet it still seems to run rampant.
Yeah.
The sons of Eli, right?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Who were priests who had this responsibility and, taking more of their fair share of the food and lying with women at the gate. I mean, using, and the shepherds in Ezekiel, the leaders of Israel, who, again, are being promiscuous. Like, sexual infidelity on the part of religious people of power is warned against in the Bible.
Yeah.
It's a real temptation, and it's a real temptation because people like that have been able to get away with it for so long.
Yeah. Well, and I think it speaks to God's concern with justice. Going back to the introduction about these two elders, back to verse 9, it says they suppress their consciences, turn their eyes away from looking to heaven, or remembering their duty to administer justice. Like, that's the accusation that's brought against them right in the introduction to the story. And so now we get a story that illustrates their willingness to suppress justice. And to bring an unjust claim against this woman who was completely innocent. And so I think that, part of the function of this story is to encourage exilic people to think about what justice really looks like. And part of the reason they're in exile in the first place was their lack of concern for justice. And so we've got to turn around. We've got to become a just people.
Yeah. So this is the end of, I guess, Act 2, right? And, it ends in the worst possible way. The assembly believed them and condemned her to death.
Yep.
But there's a turning point, Sam.
But wait, there's more. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice and said, "O eternal God, you know what is secret and are aware of all things before they come to be. You know that these men have given false evidence against me, and now I am to die, though I've done none of the wicked things they have charged against me." The Lord heard her cry. Just as she was being led off to execution, God stirred up the Holy Spirit of a young lad named Daniel, and he shouted with a loud voice, "I want no part in shedding this woman's blood."
Ta-dum.
Daniel, hero of the story.
Yes, out of nowhere, Daniel shows up, prompted by the Spirit of God to say something. And I love this because, any Jewish person reading this would immediately think of the Exodus, where God heard their cries and heard their groaning and did something about it. And Susanna cries out to God. God hears her, and he does something about it in the form of this guy named Daniel, who till now we don't know who he is.
Yep.
Well, we do, but we don't.
Right. Obscure young man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Picking up verse 47.
And this is the best part to read. I'm so jealous you get it.
You better read it well.
I know. Don't screw this up, Ron. All the people turned to him and asked, "What is this you're saying?" Taking his stand among them, he said, "Are you such fools, O Israelites, as to condemn a daughter of Israel without examination and without learning the facts? Return to the court, for these men have given false evidence against her." So all the people hurried back, and the rest of the elders said to him, "Come, sit among us and inform us, for God has given you the standing of an elder." Ooh, that's pretty good stuff. Daniel, young man, given the standing of an elder. Big deal. Daniel said to them, "Separate them far from each other, and I will examine them." When they were separated from each other, he summoned one of them and said to him, "You old relic of wicked ways." I love that.
Wicked days.
Yeah, or wicked days. Yeah, not wicked days. "Your sins have now come home, which you have committed in the past, pronouncing unjust judgments, condemning the innocent, and acquitting the guilty, though the Lord said, 'You shall not put an innocent and righteous person to death.' Now then, if you really saw this woman, tell me this. Under what tree did you see them being intimate with each other?" He answered, "Under a mastic tree." And Daniel said, "Very well. This lie has cost you your head, for the angel of the Lord has received the sentence from God and will immediately cut you in two." judgment. Then putting him to the one side, he ordered them to bring the other. And he said to them, "You offspring of Canaan." Wow, you Canaanite. "And not of Judah. Beauty has beguiled you, and lust has perverted your heart. This is how you have been treating the daughters of Israel. And they were intimate with you through fear. But a daughter of Judah would not tolerate your wickedness."
Shots fired.
I know, man. Daniel's going hard against these guys. "Now then, tell me, under what tree did you catch them being intimate with each other?" And he answered, "Under an evergreen oak." Daniel said to him, "Very well. This lie has cost you also your head. For the angel of God is waiting with a sword to split you in two, so as to destroy you both." All right, I'm going to pause there because I want to let you have an opportunity to read a little bit. But this is Daniel's, this is his wisdom. Daniel is like, I know these guys are lying, and I have the perfect way to trap them. And so, let's get the details out there. And this is where he said, you did not examine this closely, and like bringing them together. You can't let them, collaborate with each other. Separate them, And so if the people would have done this themselves, they wouldn't have needed Daniel to step in. But Daniel, a young man who kind of reminds me of Joseph from the Old Testament, that same sort of wise spirit, is able to expose their lies. And not just expose their lies, but to exonerate Susanna. And so, this is the best part of the story. I just love the way he just, pounces on these guys. Doesn't hold anything
You old
back.
relic.
That's so good.
You Canaanite. You Northern Kingdomer.
Yeah.
Northern Kingdom.
And he does. I mean, that is a fascinating thing. Like, the women from the north did it, out of fear. But a woman from the south would never.
Yeah, I know Judah
Right.
woman.
Yeah.
They're like, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I got a little bit of, tribal pride going
Yeah,
on there,
a little bit.
without a doubt.
Yeah, I think of, and again, the association with wisdom and wisdom figures, I think, is appropriate. Not just Joseph, but of course Solomon, who his first trial is the two women and the dead baby, and
Right,
the whole
yeah.
split them in two and bring them together. So
Yeah.
it's got reminiscent of that sort of story.
Yeah, without a doubt. The splitting in two. Yeah, and this, the Israelites prided themselves on being a people of wisdom. And that's what, God said, I think it was Deuteronomy 4:6, if I remember right, that the nations will see that you are a wise people. People who listen to God are wise. And Daniel, clearly a man who listens to God, even from a young age. And so he has learned a wisdom from God that he's able to apply in this situation. And this is the way all Israel should be. Learn from Daniel, become like him as an example.
Yeah. It's not clear to me whether he was an elder or whether
Right.
he's introduced as a young man, and then the other elders kind of say, "All right, we're giving you a seat at the big boy table.
Right, yeah.
Talk to us." Are they giving him the standing of an elder in that moment? Like, you have the floor, as if you're one of us,
Yeah.
or are they recognizing that, yeah, we've given you a standing of elder, you have the right to talk here?
Yeah.
You guys have a sense of.
I think I lean more towards the former. There's no sense, nothing in the story says they're surprised or anything like that. But the fact that he's a young man suggests to me that he probably hasn't been given, officially the role of an elder in the community. But there's something about the way he speaks that makes him sound like an elder. And so they're willing to give him the floor because of that. It's not his age, but, again, the wisdom of his words. It makes me think of Jesus. The only story we have from Jesus' youth in the Gospel of Luke, he's 12 years old going into the temple, and, all the teachers are amazed by the questions he's asking and the conversation that they're having. I'm sure that Luke was probably familiar with the story of Susanna. I don't know if this story influenced him including that one or not, but I do see a connection between the two. Young men who are blowing away the people around them.
It looks so much like a court TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is it like Matlock or one of those?
Yeah.
One of the old school ones.
Yeah,
where it's
going
just
back
like,
to the 80s, man.
you got the two people up there, and they're separate them and ask them while they're not in the room. It's great drama. I think this would make a great story. This would make a great movie.
It would.
I think you
agree.
could probably stretch this out enough, give enough backstory and stuff to turn this into a movie.
Yeah.
Hallmark movie.
Yeah, for sure.
Hallmark movie.
Yeah.
It would easily work there.
Yeah.
But let's see how it ends. Beginning in verse 60. Then the whole assembly raised a great shout and blessed God, who saves those who hope in him. And they took action against the two elders, because out of their own mouths Daniel had convicted them of bearing false witness. They did to them as they had wickedly planned to do to their neighbor. Acting in accordance with the law of Moses, they put him to death. Thus innocent blood was spared that day. Hilkiah and his wife praised God for their daughter Susanna, and so did her husband Joachim and all of her relatives, because she was found innocent of a shameful deed. And from that day onward, Daniel had a great reputation among the people. So you can see why they might put this as the first book, right?
Yeah, it really sets up Daniel.
From that day forward, people took this guy seriously. It's our introduction to who he is in the people's eyes.
Right.
Right. Yeah. You could see how Daniel 1 and his friends, when they're hauled off to exile and they had that test during Babylonian boot camp, that also is a great way to begin the story of Daniel.
Right.
But this is kind of a different kind of witness.
Yeah.
His rising to prominence among the Jews in exile.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, what I love about these last few verses is that it gives kind of, for me, three-ish kind of purposes behind the telling. One is obviously to remind us, Daniel's a pretty great dude. You may not have known it, but he's definitely high on our list. But then the others have to do with the abusive leadership we talked about, right? Verse especially 61, they took action against these elders because they did it falsely. They acted in accordance with Moses by saying, no, you don't bear false witness.
Yeah.
You don't abuse your power, whether you're in power or not. Like when you testify against your fellow Jew, you do it honorably and you tell the truth. And so there's aspect of it, but then there's also the part where verse 60, where God saves those who hope in him.
Yeah.
And this is the story of Israel throughout time, right? Where over and over, those who put their faith and trust in God, God has been faithful back to them. And especially, we're talking about the first century writing, whenever it was, they're still not in good shape. The Persians have come and sent them back, but it's not great. The Greeks have taken over. Romans are on the horizon. Like it's just, they're always in danger. And so,
Right.
And this is in danger within, as opposed to without. And so it's just a constant reminder of like, God is the one you put your trust in, no matter the situation, whether it's a world power bearing down on you or whether it's false people in your own midst. Call it to God, and he's the one who will make it happen, often through this crazy way, like Daniel out of nowhere starting to talk.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we see insight for the exilic community when, in your time of exile, still try to live out Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, it had to have been very complicated to live out Torah because so many of the laws presuppose that they're in their own land, they have their own autonomy, they have their own leadership and structures, and they own the land. And it would have been easy for them to say, you know what, all that's gone. Like all the social and substructure that was required to live out Torah is gone. Therefore, we don't have to do Torah anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see they're trying to do something like Torah. They're trying to have their own leaders. But even so, they're applying Torah. And one of the teachings of Torah is if someone brings false witness against someone and that they get found, they're going to suffer the consequences of the person that they were lying about. Whatever was going to happen to them, that now happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so because she was about to be put to death, that becomes the fate that they end up suffering. So what do you think about, Daniel's talking about angels ready with swords to cut people in half, but then at the end it doesn't say, and then angels showed up with the sword and cut them both in half. No, the people took him and put him to death because that's what you do in Torah. What is going on there with the angels?
At minimum, it's just a way of expressing a judgment. I think there's probably more, but the first thing it makes me think of is that it's not just about us, that there's a sort of a broader cloud of witnesses, to use the language of Hebrews, that is participating in this. And yes, the people are the ones who are the ones who are going to put him to death, but your guilt is being witnessed and testified to even by the angels, and somehow they are playing a role in all of this as well. So I don't know. First thing that came to my mind.
Yeah. Well, for me, there's two things going on. On the one hand, there's wordplay, right? If you have your text, it tells you that the trees line up with the action taken, whether it's cutting or splitting. It's kind of fun that we kind of miss out on. It's kind of like I saw them under the, I don't know, oak tree. What's a violent word that like rhymes or sounds like oak? And I don't know, something you.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I mean, that's whatever tree it might be.
So there's a wordplay going on with the trees and his judgment on that.
Yes, and so there's that, but specifically the angel. I mean, we see this all throughout. Seems to be this figure that stands for God and sometimes is equated with God. And so when you see him show up, it's not like the judgment is definitely coming from God, but it's almost like there's this separation at times from there's God's executioner. I don't know. We could probably do a whole episode about that, but just this idea of there's a slight separation. The judgment is definitely from God, but someone else is going to carry it out.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty cool. So we shouldn't over literalize that. He's saying, and it reminds me of Ananias and Sapphira. They kind of get separated from each other. They get a chance to tell the truth. They both lie. They both drop dead.
Yeah.
And it's God's doing. Like, Peter doesn't run them through. So that is more the angel of the Lord, so to speak, right? Doing it. I love, as someone who cares a lot about ecclesiology and the autonomy of like the Christian community and not letting the state govern our political affairs among our own life, but living by our own standards and values. I just think it's cool that you have this community that's there as a part of this trial, and they are the jury, the Jewish community that gathers. They're gathering at this man's house. They don't go to a courthouse.
Right.
The Jews don't necessarily have here a public building that they pay for, that they use to take people to have these trials. Like they're gathering in, one of the wealthier members of the community has enough property where we can use this as a place where we can do our own judicial system.
Yeah.
And even a young man is able to say, I disagree with what's happening here. And then the whole community is like, oh, really? Let's get back together and hear what you have to say.
Huh.
And it's really the community that decides Daniel's right, they're wrong, and that executes it. And so, it does remind me of 1 Corinthians where, Paul recognizes that there are Christians in the church who are taking fellow Christians to court so that an unbeliever would decide their dispute between them.
Yeah.
And he's like, don't you have any wise people among you who can do this? You should be handling this in-house, not before unbelievers. Yeah. And that's exactly what we have going on in Susanna.
Yeah. What's funny about that is earlier in 1 Corinthians, he's kind of scolding them for thinking they're so wise. And so It's like, you think you're so wise, but then when it comes time to use wisdom, it's like, oh, we can't handle this. We need a professional judge. And it's like, what? You guys should be really ashamed of yourself, for not handling this. But yeah, I think Susanna gives us a little glimpse into how Jews handled their business. And the early church was meant to emulate that.
Yeah. So this is our first foray into the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
Hope you liked it.
Yeah.
We're definitely having one more because we're recording here in about 5 minutes.
Yep.
A second one. So they'll both come out, but you can complain or compliment.
Yeah, this is Susanna is just one addition to Daniel.
Yes.
There are other stories, and so we're going to go through them during the next episode.
Yep.
But until then, thank you for joining us for this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Yeah.
Thank you again for listening to the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist, and social media is managed by Darren Harris.